Imagine standing at an airport counter. You've cleared security, passport in hand, suitcase rolling behind you. You're tired, hopeful, and ready for the journey ahead. Then, without warning, the agent checking your documents smirks. His lips curl into mockery. He mimics your accent, twisting every syllable into a cruel caricature. Passengers nearby chuckle under their breath. For a moment, the air feels heavier. Humiliation burns hotter than the fluorescent lights above. What that agent didn't know was this: the woman he mocked wasn't just another traveler. She was a CEO negotiating one of the largest contracts in aviation history. A $950 million deal hung in the balance. And with one act of arrogance, one slip of prejudice, he shattered everything: his reputation, his career, and his company's future. This is the story. Airports are strange places. They are gateways of hope and separation, of beginnings and endings. In their endless corridors, people carry stories on their backstories stitched into accents, passports, and names. For some, the process is simple: hand over a ticket, get a smile, board a plane. For others, every step is a test, every glance a judgment, every word an opportunity for someone to remind them that they do not belong. That morning, inside the sprawling glass walls of JFK International Airport, the story of Amara Johnson began its descent into humiliation. Amara was not an ordinary traveler. Her life had been carved out of grit and intellect, discipline and patience. Born in Lagos, Nigeria, she had grown up listening to the thunder of rain against tin roofs, the music of street vendors selling mangoes, the laughter of cousins in crowded family homes. Her parents, teachers by profession, had poured everything into her education. They believed, with a conviction forged by hardship, that knowledge was the only passport that could never be revoked. At 17, she left for the United States, alone, a young woman stepping into a foreign land with a heavy accent, limited money, and a fire in her chest that refused to die. At Stanford, she learned not just economics and logistics, but also survival. She learned how to swallow insults. When classmates laughed at the way she pronounced certain words, she learned how to steady her voice in debates when professors mistook her for less intelligent simply because her sentences carried the rhythm of another world. Her accent was never just sound. It was her history, her roots, her father's voice echoing across continents. Your accent is your crown, Amara. Never lower it for anyone. Years passed. Degrees turned into jobs. Jobs turned into opportunities. With time, Amara built her own logistics firm, small at first, then sprawling across Africa, Europe, and North America. Her company specialized in supply chain innovations, making it easier for goods to move between continents. And now, 2 decades after stepping into America as an immigrant student, she stood on the verge of finalizing a $950 million contract with one of Europe's largest airline conglomerates. The deal was historic. It would secure her company's dominance in transatlantic air cargo. It would bring thousands of jobs to communities on both sides of the ocean. And for Amara, it was more than business. It was proof that her crown, her accent, her history had carried her all the way to the top. And yet, at the airport counter that Monday morning, none of that mattered. Amara arrived early, dressed in a tailored navy suit, her braided hair pulled neatly back, her rolling suitcase trailing behind her. She moved with the quiet confidence of someone who had negotiated boardrooms filled with skeptical men in expensive suits. But here, at the check-in counter, she was not a CEO. She was simply another passenger waiting in line. The man behind the desk looked bored. His name tag read Brian Keller. Early 30s, clean-cut, the kind of sharp tie and polished shoes that suggested he enjoyed the small taste of authority his job gave him. He scanned boarding passes like he was doing the world a favor. His eyes darted quickly, his mouth curled in a smirk that never quite left his face. When Amara stepped forward, she greeted him warmly. "Good morning. I'm checking in for Zurich." Brian looked at her, then at the passport in his hand. The pause was brief, but it carried weight. His eyes lingered a moment too long on her name, on her skin. And then, with the subtle cruelty of someone who knew he could get away with it, he repeated her word. Zurich, he said, dragging the syllable, mimicking her accent. His lips exaggerated the sound, twisting it into something ugly. At first, Amara thought she misheard. Her mind raced. Did he really just... She stayed silent, unsure. But then he leaned in and said it again. Zurich. Louder this time, his tone dripping with mockery. A colleague at the next counter snickered. Two men waiting in line exchanged knowing looks. A woman behind them bit back a laugh. Heat surged through Amara's chest. She felt her stomach clench, her throat tighten. Her accent, the sound of her childhood, her family, her culture had just been turned into a joke. She forced herself to breathe. Maybe he doesn't realize what he's doing, she thought. Maybe this isn't deliberate. So she repeated herself calmly, her voice steady. Yes, Zurich. But Brian wasn't finished. He smirked and said, You people should practice before you travel. Makes it easier for the rest of us to understand. The words sliced through her. You people. Casual, dismissive, loaded with centuries of history. Words that reduced her from CEO, visionary, negotiator of billion-dollar deals, to just another foreigner, another accent that didn't belong. Amara wanted to respond, to push back, to demand his supervisor. She wanted to tell him that her company's potential partnership could make or break the very airline he represented. But she held herself back. Years in corporate America had taught her a painful truth. Anger from a black woman was never read as righteous, it was read as aggression. And aggression closed doors. So she did what she had always done. She lifted her chin, steadied her voice, and said, Please process my ticket. Brian chuckled, tapped his keyboard lazily, and finally printed her boarding pass. He slapped it onto the counter with a casual flick of his hand. And then, just to twist the knife, he said it again. Have a nice flight? Zurich. This time louder. This time with deliberate cruelty. The people in line didn't say a word. Some smirked. Others looked away. Silence can be just as violent as laughter. Amara picked up her documents with hands that refused to tremble. She turned, her heels clicking sharply against the polished floor, her spine straight, her face calm. But inside a storm raged. The humiliation sat heavy in her chest, threatening to crush her. She walked toward the terminal, trying to shake the sting. Her mind replayed the scene over and over, his smirk, his tone, the chuckles of strangers. She thought of her father's words. Your accent is your crown. But right now, her crown felt like a target. Still, she knew something Brian Keller did not. She wasn't just a passenger, she wasn't just another woman boarding a flight. She was about to step into a meeting that could redefine global logistics. A $950 million partnership was within her grasp. And now, as she replayed Brian's cruelty, something inside her shifted. This wasn't just an insult. It wasn't just another moment of everyday racism she would swallow and move past. No, this was a warning sign. A glimpse into the culture of the company she was about to tie her future to. And in that sterile airport hall, with fluorescent lights buzzing overhead and announcements echoing through the air, Amara made a silent promise to herself. This humiliation would not go unanswered. What Brian thought was a joke was, in fact, the first crack in a billion-dollar relationship. A careless mockery that would ripple far beyond the counter, beyond the airport, and into the boardrooms of the world. The flight from New York to Zurich was 7 hours, but for Amara, it felt like a lifetime. She sat in her window seat, the clouds rolling endlessly below, but her mind was not on the view. Her mind was still at the counter. Brian's smirk, his exaggerated syllables, the chuckles of strangers. The humiliation replayed over and over like a scratched record. Each time it played, it cut deeper. Each time, it reminded her that no matter how high she climbed, no matter how much she achieved, there would always be someone waiting to pull her crown off her head and trample it under their boots. She tried to distract herself with documents, flipping through the final draft of the contract waiting for her in Zurich. The numbers stared back. $950 million. The biggest deal of her career. A partnership that would lock her company into Europe's largest airline for decades. And yet, beneath the numbers, the memory of the counter lingered. If this was how they treated one of their most valuable partners, COO, in plain sight, what did it say about their culture? Their values? Their respect for diversity? The thought gnawed at her, sharp and relentless. When the plane landed, Zurich greeted her with its usual cold efficiency. Clean platforms, punctual trains, polite announcements in 3 languages. Amara had always admired the Swiss precision and environment where everything seemed to click into place. But this time, as she stepped into the grand glass atrium of the airline's headquarters, she carried a weight that precision could not erase. Inside the boardroom, the air smelled faintly of polished wood and leather chairs. Executives filled the room, their suits crisp, their smiles practiced. They greeted her warmly, speaking of numbers, strategy, vision. To them, this was business. But to Amara, the memory of Brian's mockery colored every handshake, every smile. She looked across the table at Hans Meyer, the airline's CEO, silver hair, blue tie, a voice that carried authority. He spoke of partnership and opportunity. He spoke of shared futures. But in Amara's ears, his words collided with Brian's voice. You people should practice before you travel. She tried to push it aside. She tried to focus on the numbers, the logistics, the strategy. Yet, every time she looked at the airline's logo on the documents, she saw Brian's smirk stamped over it. The face of the company, the culture behind the brand, suddenly it all felt tainted. As the meeting continued, Amara noticed small things. Jokes exchanged between executives in German, leaving her momentarily excluded. A curious glance when she pronounced a technical term slightly differently. Polite but distant. Respectful but not quite equal. The weight grew heavier. During the lunch break, she sat in the cafeteria, alone with her thoughts. Around her, employees chatted in rapid-fire German, laughter echoing through the room. She sipped her water, but her mind was elsewhere. She thought about Brian again, his words. His tone, the silence of the people in line. It wasn't just an isolated incident. It was a reflection of something bigger, a culture where mockery went unchecked, where silence gave permission, where an accent, a crown was twisted into a weapon. She remembered a time, years ago, when she was just starting her company. A potential investor had once told her, "You're impressive, Amara, but maybe you should consider hiring someone else to do the talking, someone without the accent." He said it as though it was advice, as though it was kindness. But to her, it was a knife. A reminder that brilliance was never enough if it didn't sound like what they wanted to hear. And now, in Zurich, on the verge of her biggest deal, she was hearing the same knife scraping against her skin again. The boardroom reconvened. Discussions deepened. Terms were finalized. Everyone expected the signing to happen the next day. Champagne was already chilling in the executive lounge. But Amara's resolve was shifting. The humiliation at the airport had become more than a memory. It had become a lens, a filter that revealed cracks beneath the polished surface of the deal. That evening, she returned to her hotel room overlooking the Limette River. The city sparkled in the winter night. Church bells echoed in the distance. But inside, her room was heavy with silence. She sat at the desk, staring at the contract spread open before her. The pages glistened under the lamp, promising wealth, security, legacy. But the promise rang hollow. She imagined what would happen if she signed. Her company tied to theirs, her employees tied to theirs. Would they face the same mockery, the same dismissal? Would her crown and the crowns of those who spoke like her always be tarnished under this partnership? Her pen hovered over the dotted line, but her hand did not move. Instead, she thought of her father again. His voice, strong and unwavering, "Your accent is your crown." She thought of the generations before her who had carried that crown through colonization, migration, discrimination. She thought of the young employees in her company who looked up to her, who needed her to prove that dignity was not something to be negotiated away for profit. Her chest tightened, her eyes burned. She knew what she had to do. But it would not be easy. Walking away from nearly $1 billion meant shaking the foundations of everything she had built. It meant explaining to shareholders, employees, partners why she let the deal collapse. It meant risking her reputation, her company's future. Yet deep inside, she knew the truth. Some deals are too expensive, even if they promise billions. The next morning, she returned to the boardroom. Executives smiled, documents ready. Hans Meyer extended his hand, expecting celebration. Cameras had been arranged for a photo session, but Amara didn't reach for the pen. She placed her hand on the table, steady, and spoke in a voice that was calm but unshakable. "Gentlemen, I cannot sign this deal." The room fell silent. Confusion rippled across their faces. Murmurs spread. Hans leaned forward, brows furrowed. "Amara, may I ask why?" She inhaled, steadying herself. "Because your company does not respect the voices of the people it claims to partner with." Gasps, silence. Her words landed like thunder in the polished room. She didn't give them the details. She didn't tell them about Brian Keller, about the humiliation at the counter. But she didn't need to. Her refusal was enough. Her dignity was enough. She closed the folder, stood tall, and said, "My crown is not for sale." Then she walked out, leaving nearly $1 billion on the table. The room behind her buzzed with shock, disbelief, outrage. But Amara didn't look back. The humiliation that began at a simple airport counter had now exploded into the heart of a global corporation. And this was only the beginning of the storm. This chapter ends with Amara's refusal to sign, the escalation of tension. The insult is no longer private. It's about to become a corporate earthquake. The walk out of the Zurich boardroom should have felt liberating. But as Amara stepped into the corridor, her heels striking the marble floor, it didn't feel like freedom. It felt like a storm. Behind the glass doors, executives were scrambling, whispering in sharp German, trying to make sense of what had just happened. A $950 million deal expected, planned, already celebrated in their minds had been shattered in seconds. And all because one woman, with an accent they mocked, refused to bow. For Amara, the choice had not been easy. Her entire company had pinned its future growth on this contract. Investors would question her judgment. Shareholders would panic. Employees would fear for their jobs. She knew what was waiting for her when she returned home, a flood of phone calls, emails, headlines. But she also knew something else. There are moments in life when silence costs more than resistance. Signing the deal after what she endured would have been a betrayal not just of herself, but of every voice that had ever been silenced, mocked, or dismissed for sounding different. She took the elevator down, each floor descending like a countdown. Her reflection stared back at her in the mirrored walls poised, calm but carrying the weight of generations. That night, back in her hotel room, the storm broke. Alone, she sat on the edge of the bed, her body trembling. She replayed the scene at JFK in her head again and again, Brian's smirk, his mockery, the laughter of strangers, and now the stunned silence of Zurich executives. Tears burned at the edges of her eyes, but she didn't let them fall. She knew tomorrow the world would come for answers. And it did. By morning, the story had already leaked. Journalists caught wind of the mysterious collapse of one of the largest logistics deals in aviation history. The Swiss airline released a short statement. "We regret to announce that negotiations have ended without agreement. We remain committed to future partnerships." But whispers spread quickly. Insiders spoke of tensions, of cultural misunderstandings, of Amara walking out without signing. Reporters began circling, hungry for details. Back in New York, her investors were furious. $950 million, Amara. Do you understand what you've cost us?" Her phone rang nonstop, emails flooded in. Some accused her of arrogance, others begged her to reconsider. A few, quietly, told her they admired her stand but not loudly enough to matter. Her board demanded explanations. What happened? Did they insult the numbers? The terms? Did they pull back on promises? Amara stayed silent. She could have told them the truth that the collapse of the deal began not in Zurich, but in New York at an airport counter where an employee mocked her accent. But how could she explain to them that humiliation, that sting, that lifelong wound? To them, it would sound trivial. To them, it would not justify the loss of nearly $1 billion. And yet, for Amara, it was everything days past. The pressure grew. Newspapers speculated. Competitors celebrated. Headlines painted her as reckless. CEO walks away from fortune. Share prices dipped. Analysts called her decision irrational. She knew she couldn't stay silent forever. So one evening she called a press conference. The room filled with cameras, reporters jostling for space, lights glaring hot against her skin. She stood at the podium, her accent clear, her voice steady. "I want to explain," she began, her eyes scanning the crowd. "The reason I walked away from this deal is simple. Dignity? Dignity for myself, for my employees, and for every person who has ever been told that their voice, their accent, their identity was a flaw to be corrected." Murmurs rippled through the room. Pens scribbled furiously. Cameras clicked. "A week ago at JFK Airport, one of this airline's employees mocked me, not for my paperwork, not for my ticket, for my accent, for the sound of my history. And in that moment, I realized something. If this is how they treat a potential partner at the highest level, how would they treat those with less power? How would they treat the everyday traveler, the everyday worker, the everyday voice?" The room went silent. Every reporter, every camera, every microphone leaned closer. "I walked away," she said, her voice firm, "because no contract, no matter how large, is worth my crown. My accent is not a flaw. It is not a joke. It is not something to be erased for your comfort. My accent is my crown, and I will not place it on the table as collateral." For a moment, silence hung heavy. Then applause erupted, not from everyone, but from enough. Some clapped cautiously. Others clapped with conviction. The story exploded. News outlets across the world carried her words. Headlines shifted. "Amara Johnson, the CEO who said no to disrespect." Clips of her speech went viral, shared across social media. Hashtags trended. Thousands of people from Africa, Asia, Latin America, people whose voices had been mocked in classrooms, offices, airports, shared their own stories. Hashtag my accent, my crown. It became more than her story. It became a movement. But with the movement came backlash. Critics accused her of exaggeration, of playing the race card, of being overly sensitive. Commentators on television debated whether an accent was really worth $950 million. Investors still fumed. Her company's stock wavered. And through it all, Amara stood firm. She thought of her father again, of his voice carrying across oceans. "Your accent is your crown." She thought of her younger employees who now wore their accents with a little more pride. She thought of every person who had written to her saying, "Thank you. You spoke for me." Yes, the storm was fierce. Yes, the cost was heavy. But sometimes breaking points are not the end. They are the beginning. For Amara, the breaking point at JFK had led to a global conversation. A cruel smirk had ignited a movement. Brian Keller, the man who mocked her accent? His name, once meaningless, was now plastered across headlines. His arrogance had cost his company $950 million. The storm was far from over. The storm did not fade. It grew. When Amara's press conference aired, it was clipped, dissected, replayed on every major news network. Anchors debated it. Panelists argued, opinion columns flared up overnight. But the story was no longer just about a failed deal. It was about racism, about dignity, about what it costs to say no. The Swiss airline scrambled. Their press office issued statements filled with corporate jargon. "We value diversity. We regret the misunderstanding. We will investigate the matter internally." But it was too late. The world had already connected the dots. A $950 million contract had evaporated because of the arrogance of one employee and the silence of everyone around him. Shareholders panicked. Stocks dipped sharply. Analysts estimated billions in future losses as other potential partners grew cautious. "If this is how they treat high-profile executives," one commentator said on live television, "what does it say about their brand?" Suddenly, Brian Keller, the airport employee who once believed he was invisible, untouchable in his small role, was at the center of a global scandal. His mocking words, meant to humiliate one woman in line, had ricocheted through the corridors of power and detonated in boardrooms across the world. Within days, the airline announced his termination. But it was not enough. People demanded accountability higher up. They wanted to know why this culture of mockery had gone unchecked. They wanted to know why no one in line at JFK had spoken up. Brian vanished from public sight, but reporters found his neighbors, his past, his social media posts. Old comments resurfaced, jokes about accents, memes mocking immigrants. The picture was clear. This was not an isolated slip of the tongue. It was a pattern. And the company, whether they admitted it or not, had let it fester. Meanwhile, Amara's life was a whirlwind. Every interview request, every speaking invitation, every camera wanted her words. She became a symbol of resistance, of pride, of refusing to bend. But symbols pay a price. At home, her company's boardrooms buzzed with unease. Investors still grumbled. Contracts that were once secure now felt shaky. Competitors whispered, "She's unstable." She lets emotions ruin business. Some employees feared layoffs if profits dropped. Amara bore it all, the weight of expectation, the burden of doubt. And in the quiet hours, when the cameras were gone and the applause faded, she felt the toll. Nights where she sat alone in her apartment, staring at city lights, wondering if she had done the right thing. Nights where the cost of dignity pressed against her ribs like a heavy stone. She thought about her younger self at Stanford, struggling to be heard, mocked for mispronouncing simple words. She thought about every boardroom where she forced herself to breathe slowly, to not let her anger rise when someone interrupted her mid-sentence. And she realized this was not just her story. This was the story of millions who lived with the same weight. And now it was on her shoulders to carry it publicly. The backlash intensified. On talk shows, pundits said, "It's just an accent." Was it really worth $950 million? Online trolls flooded her social media with insults, mocking her accent in videos, parodying her speeches. She refused to respond, but each clip was a reminder that the world had not changed overnight. And yet there was hope. Every day, letters arrived at her office. Emails flooded her inbox. Young immigrants wrote, "Thank you. I used to feel ashamed of how I sound. Now I know it's my crown." Parents told stories of their children, ridiculed in classrooms for their voices, now holding their heads higher. Workers in airports, restaurants, call centers, people whose accents were mocked daily sent messages of gratitude. Her pain had become their strength. Back in Zurich, the airline's empire shook, lawsuits loomed. Minority shareholders threatened action. Governments raised questions about their practices. Other corporations began quietly distancing themselves, fearing guilt by association. A scandal that began with one mocking word was now reshaping global partnerships. And still, Amara stood firm. She began to speak not just as a CEO, but as an advocate. She appeared at universities, conferences, summits. Her message was clear. Dignity cannot be negotiated. Respect is not a favor. It is a foundation. But the cost remained. Share prices fell. Journalists questioned whether her company could survive without the billion-dollar deal. Some of her own board members urged her to resign. The whispers grew louder. She risked too much. She went too far. The emotional toll deepened. There were nights she felt crushed by the weight of expectation. Nights where she whispered to herself, "Was it worth it?" And then she would remember Brian's smirk. She would remember the chuckle of strangers at JFK. She would remember the silence of the people in line. And she would answer herself, yes, because silence costs more. Amara's breaking point had rippled outward. For Brian, it was the collapse of his career. For the airline, it was the loss of billions, the implosion of their reputation. For Amara, it was the heaviest burden she had ever carried. But for millions watching, it was proof that one voice, steady and unbroken, could shake the foundations of power. Months passed. The scandal that began at JFK Airport was no longer breaking news, but its echoes remained everywhere: boardrooms, classrooms, airports, living rooms. The hashtag my accent, my crown still appeared online, carried now not just as a reaction but as a movement. For Amara, the storm had reshaped her life. The Swiss Airlines' $950 million contract was gone, yes, but something else had taken its place. Something less tangible, but far more powerful. Her company, though bruised, had not collapsed. Investors who once threatened to abandon her began to see something they had overlooked: loyalty. Clients stayed. Some even grew closer, inspired by her stand. You showed the world who you are, one longtime partner told her. We want to work with people who lead with values, not just profit. And slowly, new opportunities emerged. Not as grand, not as immediate, but built on stronger foundations. Partnerships with companies who wanted to align with dignity, not just numbers. Deals that may never have come without the storm. But the greatest shift was not in contracts. It was in culture. In airports around the world, staff were retrained. Diversity workshops were no longer check-the-box exercises. They carried urgency because corporations feared becoming the next Zurich scandal. Airlines launched campaigns about respect and inclusivity. Cynical, yes but real changes began trickling down. Employees noticed. Passengers noticed. And everyday people, teachers, nurses, engineers, shopkeepers, wore their accents differently. They spoke a little louder. They corrected mockery a little quicker. They carried themselves with a little more pride. Because Amara's refusal had cracked something open. For Amara, redemption did not come in applause. It came in quiet moments. One evening, months after the scandal, she sat in her office overlooking the New York skyline. The city lights glittered like scattered jewels across the night. She opened an envelope, one of the many letters she still received daily. This one was from a young boy in London. "Dear Miss Johnson," it read. "My teacher used to laugh at me when I read aloud because of my accent. But I watched your speech. Now I tell myself my accent is my crown. Thank you." Amara read it twice, her throat tightening, tears threatening at the edges of her eyes. $1 billion could not buy that. 1,000 contracts could not equal it. Her father's voice echoed again, "Your accent is your crown." And now those words had become the anthem of countless others. But redemption was never simple. There were scars. Her company still bore financial wounds. Her reputation, though stronger in some circles, was permanently divided in others. Some investors would never forgive her. Some competitors would always whisper. And deep inside, she carried the memory of that humiliation Brian's smirk, the silence of the line etched into her bones. Yet she understood now, true redemption is not about erasing scars. It is about wearing them as proof that you survived, proof that you stood, proof that you did not bend. And so, Amara transformed her pain into a mission. She launched a foundation under the banner "My Accent, My Crown." It provided scholarships for immigrant students. It funded training programs for corporations. It created spaces where voices, no matter their sound, were celebrated. She spoke not just in boardrooms, but in schools, in community centers, in places where her presence mattered most. And everywhere she went, people told her the same thing. "Because of you, I no longer hide my voice." And what of the airline? The scandal never faded completely. Competitors overtook them. Their reputation remained stained, their stock slow to recover. They became a cautionary tale in business schools, the $950 million mockery. A lesson that culture is not a side issue, it is the core of survival. And Brian Keller? His name remained forever tied to the scandal. He lost his job, his career, his anonymity. In interviews, he tried to defend himself. "It was just a joke," he said. But the world no longer listened. Because sometimes the smallest cruelty carries the loudest consequences. In the end, Amara's story was not about him. It was not about Zurich or a lost deal or even a billion-dollar scandal. It was about the truth her father had whispered across oceans. "Your accent is your crown." She had refused to let the world strip it from her head. She had refused to exchange it for profit. And in doing so, she gave countless others permission to wear theirs too. On a quiet Sunday morning, months after the chaos, Amara walked through Central Park. The air was crisp, the trees whispering with autumn leaves. A stranger stopped her, a woman with an Indian accent, walking with her daughter. "Are you Amara Johnson?" the woman asked. Amara smiled. "Yes." The woman's eyes filled with tears. "Thank you. My daughter used to beg me to change the way I speak. Now she tells me she loves it." The little girl, no older than 7, looked up shyly and said, "Your crown is beautiful." Amara knelt, smiled at the child, and replied softly, "So is yours." In that moment, she understood the full weight of what had happened. She had not just walked away from a contract. She had walked into history. Redemption was not found in wealth. Redemption was found in legacy. And her legacy was clear. She turned humiliation into power, mockery into movement, silence into voice. Her crown had become a crown for millions. In the end, what happened at JFK Airport was not just a moment. It was a mirror. A mirror reflecting how quickly dignity can be stripped, how easily silence can wound, and how arrogance can destroy empires. A smirk, a mocking word, a laugh in a crowded line. That was all it took to unravel a $950 million contract. To collapse reputations? To change the course of lives? But it was also all it took to ignite something greater. A movement. A truth carried by millions who know the sting of being told their voice does not belong. Amara Johnson walked away from wealth, but she walked into something far more powerful. Legacy. Her story reminds us that respect is not a luxury, it is not a courtesy. It is a non-negotiable. And when stripped of it, the cost is higher than any dollar figure could measure. For every accent mocked, for every laugh swallowed in silence, for every crown forced into hiding, this story is a reminder. Dignity is not for sale. This has been another story of injustice, resilience, and truth. A story that asks us to look closer at the everyday moments where racism hides in plain sight. Because sometimes the smallest cruelty can spark the loudest storm. You've been watching Everyday Racism Drama.